Hello, I'm Malcolm Douglas, and I'm sitting on the old Pearling Wharf at Broome. Now, everyone's heard of Broome. It's situated on the far northwest coast of Western Australia, and it's the pearling capital of the world. Yes, that's true. The old traditional pearling luggers that served the industry well for almost 100 years have almost disappeared now, but the pearlers are still out there looking for the elusive pearl shell. Their boats are different, their techniques are different, but they're still after the shell. They're not after the really big shell anymore, they're after the small mother of pearl shell to take to their farms so they can culture pearls. For all along this coast, the pearlers grow the biggest and best cultured pearls in the world. Now, not many people see the pearlers working because they're away from Broome. But I live in Broome, and the pearlers are my friends, and I know the industry well. So for the next few months, I'm going to travel with the pearlers on their boats and to their farms, so I can show you some of the secrets of this magical pearling coast.
Broome, the port of pearls, 100 years old and so different from any other place in Australia. This magical old town sprawls beside Roebuck Bay. The forefathers of this polyglot community came to seek fortune from Malaya, the Celebes, Japan and the Philippines. With the Aborigines and Europeans, they worked on luggers, diving deep for the elusive pearl shell. In 1688, the buccaneer and explorer William Dampier found pearl shell when he sailed along the northwest coast. But it was not until the 1850s that the first shell was collected in Shark Bay. The Pinctada maxima was the biggest and most valuable shell, and Broome, with its shallow tidal creeks, soon became the pearling capital of the world. Within 50 years, pearling was the fastest growing industry in Western Australia. The mother of pearl was shipped overseas to supply the lucrative button market. Occasionally, a natural pearl provided a lucky bonus. In the fabulous days before World War I, Broome grew, spreading out from the shores of Roebuck Bay. 400 boats collected shell, and during the lay-up season, Dampier Creek was crammed with luggers. Broome was a boom town with a population of 5,000 boisterous, boozing citizens. In 1914, when war broke out in Europe, the pearl shell industry collapsed overnight. Shell was worthless, and the master pearlers were ruined. After the war, they battled on until the Depression affected the demand for buttons again. Then the Second World War completely crippled the struggling enterprise, when buttons were made from the newly invented plastics. The pearl shell industry seemed doomed. It was miraculously rescued from total demise by the development of the cultured pearl. Once again, there was a reprieve for Broome, and today pearling's bigger than ever. Malcolm, a resident of Broome, has been able to capture the mysteries of the fabulous pearl on film. The backbone of pearling for 100 years were the luggers, graceful craft usually 60 feet long and ketch-rigged. Under full sail, they were a magnificent sight. Most of the luggers were constructed in Broome, and the remnants of the once huge fleet were still being refitted as recently as the 1970s. At the end of the wet season, the fleet sailed from Broome out to the most prolific shell grounds. Life on board was tough, conditions were cramped and the hours long. For over 100 years, the copper helmets and rubber suits enabled the divers to descend deep into the eerie, silent world below the sea. At first light, the crew were already busy on deck preparing for the day's work. The divers had to be helped into the cumbersome, bulky equipment. They worked in their thick rubber suits until sundown. As the sun rose, the diver was ready to hit the water. He adjusted his air valve as the lead weights and heavy boots dragged him down. His lifelines to the surface were the orange air hose and the heavy manila rope. On the sea floor, he filled his suit with air and lumbered slowly through the murky gloom. When shell was spotted, he signalled to his tender for more rope. If the seabed was barren, he called for a fast drift and was pulled roughly along. Covered with weed and coral growth, shell was easily spotted by an experienced diver. A faint outline in the mud was all that could be seen. With his basket full, the diver gave the ascent signal and closed off his air valve. His suit filled with air and he rose to the surface. A lugger supported 2 divers, and the Japanese and Malays were the best for the job. The diver had a break while the lugger was repositioning for another drift over the shell beds. The shell, scrubbed clean, was packed in bags ready for sorting back in Broome. The divers, skilled and courageous, were regarded with awe and respect. A good diver could make a fortune in a few seasons, returning to his village a wealthy and honoured man. But in the early days, the risks were enormous and the chances of survival slim. Nothing was known about decompression sickness, a painful death by paralysis that struck when the diver worked too long at a great depth. The diver surfaced, unaware that on his return to the lugger, he would suddenly double up with the pain of the bends as nitrogen bubbles lodged in his joints. Between 1910 and 1917, 145 divers in the Broome fleet died, and many more were crippled for life. The Broome Cemetery today displays a stark reminder of the tragic loss of life before the cause of this agonising death was discovered. By 1918, the mystery of the bends was solved, and with the installation of a decompression chamber in Broome, the number of deaths dropped dramatically. Although some of the divers chose to ignore the new regulations and continue to take enormous risks, hoping to collect more shell than the other crews. When the boats returned to port, the small jetties were a hive of activity. The shell was laboriously unloaded and dragged to the sorting sheds. Nowhere else in Australia were so many nationalities indentured to support an industry, and after 3 generations, this has given Broome a unique character. Every year on the eve of the August moon, this multiracial community gets together for the Shinju Matsuri, the festival of the pearl. And where else would a Chinese dragon and a Scottish pipe band parade together? Broome's population swells to 15,000 when everybody comes to town for the Shinju Matsuri. The week-long celebration has become the most exciting small-town festival in Australia. And when it's all over, the crowds disperse, the tourists continue their round Australia travels, and Broome settles down again to its own easygoing pace. The mild climate, delightful beaches and oriental influence due to a century of pearling has put Broome on the tourist map. An old streeter and mailboat lies careened, awaiting a buyer. For the luggers have now been superseded by faster, bigger, more efficient vessels. South from Broome, in the shallow waters of the 80-mile beach, the last Broome lugger, the John Louis B3, is still at work, although the diving techniques have been updated. Gone forever are the old copper helmets. The men now dive in wetsuits, goggles, flippers, and trailing a light air hose. Without adequate facilities on board the old boat, the shell collected during the season's been stored in dumps on the seabed. The men working in appalling visibility collect the shell for transferal to the farm. Plastic bags are inflated to lift the laden baskets to the surface. These days, only small shells are allowed to be taken for culturing pearls. Packed in containers, it can be kept alive for several hours out of the water. Back in Broome, Rudy Vandercroft is taking off in his de Havilland Beaver float plane. He's to rendezvous with the John Louis B3 to pick up their shell, an innovation that the early pearlers could not have imagined in their wildest dreams. It's a blustery day with wind gusts to 30 knots, so the lugger's skipper heads for the sheltered waters off the 80-mile beach.
Not even worth trying to turn around. There. It's too hard on the old propeller, right?
For Rudy, it's always an exhilarating time, landing on choppy seas. The crew works quickly, for planes are expensive to hire, and before the winds increase, the pilot with a heavy load needs to get airborne as soon as possible.
Watch out. Hey, you're right.
Back in Broome, the shell will be transferred to a Cessna for the flight to the Pearl Farm. After a number of flights, all the shell's been offloaded and the B3 heads north to the farm at Deepwater Point in King Sound. The John Louis is the last traditional lugger working off Broome, and when it goes, a special part of Australian seafaring history will be lost forever. The men relax, landing some nice Spanish mackerel. Lenny, a Torres Strait Islander and a top diver, takes one from Malcolm for tea. At Broome, Malcolm leaves the lugger and heads overland to the pearl farms. Along the way, he stops at Beagle Bay to visit the church, the most inspiring building in the northwest. In 1914, a Catholic order of German priests were interned on the mission, and throughout the war years built the church as a confirmation of their faith. The Aboriginal community cut the timber, made the bricks, and searched the shallows for shells. Pearl shell inlays glow in the reflected light. The altar, the tabernacle, and even the floor display the totemic designs of the local tribes, interwoven with symbols of the Christian faith. It's surely a remarkable building, but being so far from the main road, it's seen by few travellers.
We've just reached Norman Creek at the top of Beagle Bay. Now what we're going to do in the morning, when it's a lot calmer than it is now, we're going to run our dinghy out here and about 30 nautical miles out to the Lassipedes. You got a bit of that gear there, mate? And when we get to the Lassipedes, we're going to camp there for a couple of days. You normally can't go to the Lassipedes because it's a nature reserve, but I've got a permit to go out there. And the Lassipedes is very famous because in the early days, the pearlers used to use it as a base. But let's wait until we get out there and have a look at it.
While waiting for the winds to drop, Malcolm and his mates run a net out in the sheltered waters of Norman Creek. It doesn't take long to collect a feed of magnificent whiting. Many of these areas along the coast are either Aboriginal reserves, wildlife sanctuaries, or pearling leases, and cannot be entered without permission. The following morning, conditions are calmer, and Malcolm heads due west for 20 nautical miles to the Lassipede Islands, low, sandy spits that have played an important part in the history of pearling. These islands are the main breeding grounds for the gregarious booby gannets. It's late in the season, and the fledgling boobies launch themselves unsteadily into the air.
Well, these are the Lassipede Islands. Quiet and remote now. It's a nature reserve. And you're not supposed to come out here without a permit, although some people do. But the Lassipedes have got a notorious and bloody past. Very few people know that this was the only part of Australia that was ever taken over by a foreign power. Yes, our friends the Americans, they raised their flag here around about 1876. They're after this, bird droppings, guano. They're going to dig it up, take it across to South America. In fact, they got a load out of here. Well, that caused an international incident, and of course, it was finally handed back to Australia. And in front of me, I've got this, what appears to be an old building. And this is another clue to the past of the Lassipedes. In the early days, some of the pearlers, they went over to the mainland and they captured young Aboriginal boys and girls, teenagers. And they kept them here, like a bank of slaves, and very few people in Australia realise this. Then the other pearlers came up from Cossack and Roban, the pearling towns down south here, and they traded for these teenagers, and they took them down there to die for pearl shell. The pearlers would row around in their boats, taking the teenagers with them, tip them over the side in the shallow water, make them feel around on the bottom for pearl shell. If they came up with any shell, the shell was put in the boat and had to dive again. But if they came up with that shell, the pearler had a big waddy, hit them on the knuckles and on the head, send them down for shell. It's a terrible story, but it's true.
Within a few years, this barbaric practice was forbidden. Once again, the islands became a tranquil sanctuary for seabirds, disturbed only during the pearling season, when the waters around the Lassipedes proved to be one of the most prolific shell grounds of the northwest coast. In their brief contact with the islands, the blackbirders introduced an unwelcome rodent, and now camping on the islands is extremely unpleasant. The men have had a sleepless night, and footprints through the camp plainly show the cause of the disturbance. Rat tracks. Malcolm chases one. It's Rattus rattus, the common rat. An ugly animal, they're an ecological disaster preying on the breeding seabirds. Rats show no mercy. These are baby cormorants. If the parents leave the nests unguarded, the rats attack. The rats are able to escape the fierce heat by tunnelling under the hard crust of bird droppings that's built up over thousands of years. The babies, wrapped in a white ball of fluff, look bigger than their parents. Showing no fear of Malcolm, the chicks pose for the camera. Growing rapidly, they go through a dowdy, scruffy adolescent stage. In the evenings, the adults return to regurgitate the catch for their impatient young. Malcolm and his mates plan a fishing trip of their own for the following morning.
Fishing's pretty good on the Pearling Coast, and a lot of my mates ask me what's my favourite lure. Well, I'll show you one of my secrets, the old sunshine milk tin lid. And when you run out of lures, you can pull out this bit of foil that's in the top, put it back on the lid, and grab that piece of foil and wrap it around the hook. Now don't laugh, because this does really make an exceptionally good lure. Righto, now we just get that around there. Twist it around, just shape it up like a fish. Now I'll work on this a little bit more for a couple of minutes. Put it down there. Crimp some lead on it so it'll stay in place. I know you're all shaking your heads with disbelief, but I tell you what, the fishing's very good up here. Righto, now I've just got to get a little bit of a tail on it. Right, there we are. Top lure, let's go and catch a fish.
Within minutes, Malcolm's landed a nice trevally on his tin lid lure.
Well, sunshine milk tin lid is working well. Here we are. Oh. How's that for a fish? You're a bit knocked up. Righto, all you fishermen, next time you come up the coast here, make sure you bring your old tin lids. It was not far from here, on the Lassipedes, that one of the great tragedies of the Broome pearling fleet occurred. It was out here in the Lassipede deeps, between the islands and the mainland. There were 29 luggers working the bottom. They're on a great patch of shell, so they anchored there overnight, ready to put the divers down first thing in the morning. Not long after sundown, the skippers noticed in the north fork lightning. So they said to their men, anchors up, sails up, let's head for the mainland. But they couldn't move because it was glassy calm, like it is this morning. And in those days, they had no auxiliary engines, so they just sat there. And as the hours passed, a cyclone hit. And in the morning, of the 29 luggers, there were only 3 still floating, and 140 men died.
Only one Japanese crewman clinging to wreckage reached the islands alive. Returning to the mainland, Malcolm heads for Deepwater Point in the sheltered expanse of King Sound. Here he meets up with the lugger B3 again. The crew are retrieving the shell from the dumps on the seafloor. This is the shell that was collected off the 80-mile beach and left on the bottom near the farm for several months to recover from the stress of collection and the plane journey. As the sediment rises, visibility drops to a few centimetres, and only an experienced diver can work all day under these conditions. After retrieval, the oysters are hung in baskets ready for the technician, who will operate on each one to produce a cultured pearl. A cultured pearl is only slightly different from a natural pearl.
Well, what actually makes a natural pearl? Well, let's just have a look at the small pearl shell here. Now, just imagine if that pearl shell is down on the bottom, and it's all covered with seaweed, of course, and it's open like that on the bottom. And the mantle, the orange section that actually makes the white substance, the nacre, is right up here on the edge. Now, the shell's lying on the bottom, and just imagine a fish swimming along here, and as it passes, it flicks its tail, and a piece of mud or shell will lodge in on that mantle. Let's just open it up and have a look. Now, this mantle is closed up. When it's in the water, this section here, it can be orange or black, is open right out. Now, the piece of mud or shell or whatever it is lodged on that mantle. Now, the first thing the animal tries to do is reject it. And if it can't reject it, well, then it starts coating the matter with the white substance, and that's called nacre. And that's what pearls are all about. Now, in this one, you can see here, just next to the little crab, a small pearl. Now, that's a natural pearl that is formed there. Something's gone in, landed on the mantle, it can't get it out. That's the animal can't get it out, so it starts coating it. And the longer it stays there, the bigger the pearl. And that's why a natural pearl is worth a lot of money, because they're very rare. You might only get one in every 20 or 30,000 shell. Now, with the cultured pearl, it's a slightly different process. We'll take the shell and open it up slightly. Now, there it is. Now, you'll see this down in the shed. What they do is they put a wedge in there and they take a nucleus. I've got one here. It's actually a piece of shell all the way from the Mississippi River. They collect this shell and they grind it up into like a ball bearing size, and they send them from Japan to Australia. Now, what the technician does, he gets that and he places it inside the animal. Let's just open this up. There we are. Well, it's actually on this side here. So he drops it in very carefully, places it near the stomach of the animal, and he cuts a piece of mantle, either from this animal or from another animal, just a small piece, and he places it right next to that nucleus. And this tiny little piece of mantle continues living, and it starts coating that nucleus with the mother of pearl. And after 2 years, you've got the Broome pearls, the biggest and best cultured pearls in the world.
On the foreshore is the heart of the pearl farm, the operating shed. The shell brought in from the floating raft each morning is placed in a shallow trough of circulating seawater. As each oyster begins to open, a wedge is jammed into the gap to make room for the technician's tools. The Japanese are no longer the top divers, but they're still a vital part of the industry, for they have the knowledge and skill to seed the oysters. The technicians all have their own special secrets, but Fuji allowed Malcolm to watch him working. First, the edge of the mantle's cut from a healthy mollusk. It's the mantle that creates the lustrous nacre. The strip is sliced and a small piece placed between the foot retractor muscle and the intestine of the host oyster to encourage it to coat the nucleus. With the nucleus in place, the clamps are removed and the oyster swiftly closes. The baskets of shell are suspended from the raft until the divers are ready to place them in selected areas. In the claustrophobic gloom 15 metres down on the muddy seafloor, the real back-breaking work begins. Steel posts are laboriously driven into the mud, so the baskets of shell can be contained in rows. Every second day for 50 days, each basket's turned so that the nacre forms evenly around the nucleus. The oysters are then hung on plastic poles and cleaned every few months. In 2 years, each shell should contain a lustrous pearl. Malcolm will return to the farms for the harvest, but now he's heading out to the graveyard, a dangerous area of King Sound where many divers perished in pursuit of pearl shell. Crossing King Sound is hazardous. The awesome power of the dropping tide surges past the rocks like a river in flood.
The waters of King Sound have always been notoriously dangerous, but the early pearlers had their preferred bays and locations for picking up shell. And there's one particular place that they used to go because there's always huge mother of pearl, huge shell. They take their luggers in and at anchor on the slack tide. That's just between, say, high tide and low tide before it changes, and there's a period of about half an hour when there's not so much movement of the water. The diver would go down with his full suit, and he'd start walking along the murky bottom, and he'd find this huge shell. So he'd be signalling to his tender, let out more rope, move me along, stop me here, give me more air, and he'd be working frantically to pick up this huge shell. He'd be filling his basket up. And of course he'd get so carried away, the next thing, the tide would change. And it'd go from virtually no current to a rushing tide, almost like a moving river under the sea. And he'd be signalling frantically to the tender, pull me up, pull me up. But of course the water pressure was so strong, he was getting dragged along the bottom. And the next thing, his air hose and his rope would be tangled up around a big coral outcrop or a rock, big coral bommy, and he'd be stuck there. And he'd be signalling away, and he couldn't get pulled up, and all the guys on board would be trying to lift him up, and of course in the end they'd lose a diver. And to this day, if you look on the nautical maps up in the top of King Sound, you'll see an area marked the graveyard, because the early pearlers lost so many divers there. In fact, a few years ago, the old Bardi Aborigines told me a story that years ago when a young Japanese diver went down in the graveyard. He was moving along and he's picking up shell, and he came to a suit, a full diving suit with a helmet and everything lying on the bottom. And he looked in and he saw the skull of a diver still in the suit. He's terribly frightened, and of course he signaled to his men to pull him up. And to this day, the Japanese divers have never gone back to the graveyard.
The graveyard's a cliff-locked harbour with a narrow entrance. The country around is harsh and to this day uninhabited. Along the lonely coastline, disintegrating and forgotten, are the graves of many Japanese divers. There's a deceptive calm at the moment. It's high water. When the tide changes, it churns up dangerous foaming seas that trapped so many of the early divers. Beneath the surface, the warm tropical waters teem with fish. One of the most spectacular is the anemone or clownfish. They're entirely dependent on the sea anemones for protection. The tentacles of this flower-like animal are covered with thousands of small stinging cells, capable of killing any other fish. With an immunity to the poison, the very territorial anemone fish spend most of their time chasing one another before retreating into the tentacles of their host. The gregarious and playful dolphins race Malcolm's boat back across King Sound to one of the oldest pearl farms on the coast at Cygnet Bay. The men working on the raft are operating on oysters that are too old for a nucleus, and so are plastic half spheres glued to the shell. The shell's kept in baskets below the raft until it's needed. The technician eases the mantle from the shell, and up to a dozen beads are glued in place. Within 9 months, the irritation's been coated with nacre. Although not so valuable, half pearls are always in demand for modern jewellery. Bruce Farley from Roebuck Deep Pearls grows some half pearls each year for his buyers. After they're cut from the shell, it's up to the imagination and artistry of the jeweller to create the finished pieces. Before heading back to Broome, Malcolm's keen to catch some fish for the crocodiles at his research station. Craig drags in a good tuna. And now the barracuda are on the bite. Out in Roebuck Bay off Broome, the harvest's in progress, and the pearlers are reaping the benefit of their hard work, huge expenses and great risks. The big operators now work off their own boats out at sea over their leases. The shell, seeded 2 years earlier, is collected by the divers. The baskets are quickly filled and the heavy load brought to the surface with air-filled bags. After cleaning, the oysters are stored in huge tanks with fresh, continuously circulating seawater. Upon opening, they're wedged and passed to one of the Japanese technicians. Methodically from each shell, he lifts a glistening pearl. If the mollusk is still young and healthy, it's reseeded with a nucleus and returned to the bottom for a further 2 years. Shell too weak or too old is rejected by the technicians for reseeding and will be sold for mother of pearl buttons. The owner of the farm probes for the cultured pearl before cleaning the shell. Strict control of the industry limits the amount of shell taken. This has led to a worldwide shortage of shell for ornaments and buttons. Another lucrative spin-off is the sale of pearl shell meat. This is the muscle that holds the oyster shut. Dried, it's used in gourmet cooking. The real prize at the end of each day are the exquisite, perfectly round pearls. Those with blemishes are worth only a few dollars, but the best will bring several $1,000s each. The harvest goes on for weeks, and the pearl farms now gross millions of dollars every year. Today, the pearling industry is bigger than ever. The luggers have all but disappeared, replaced by big modern boats. The most radical of these is a giant catamaran, owned by Signet Bay Pearls. The biggest operator in Australia is Paspaley Pearls. Their diving techniques are very efficient, with up to 8 divers working at once off the Paspaley Pearl. The divers are now full-time professionals. Many of them are ex-abalone divers who've moved to Broome for the good money and warmer climate. The cumbersome full diving suits have disappeared. Goggles have replaced the helmet. And flippers the boots, although the modern diver still uses the traditional basket. The new breed of divers are tough and incredibly fit, swimming for 8 hours a day with only short breaks. The ropes attached to the boat are each man's lifeline. Moving along just above the seabed, the diver searches for the camouflaged shell among the seaweed, sponges and coral. Without the rope, he'd quickly tire and become disoriented. It was 1971 when the new techniques were first tried off Broome, and within 2 seasons the old hard hat divers had gone forever. The risks working for Shell are great. Divers still at times get the bends, although now decompression chambers are available. The dirty water, strong currents, sharks and sea snakes are ever-present dangers. The mothership Paspaley II, a magnificent modern vessel, rendezvous with the Paspaley Pearl. The Paspaley Company has a license to collect around 100,000 pearl shells in a season. Each shell is now seeded immediately on the boat and returned to the bottom on long lines to recover for several months. Then it's all moved to pearling leases east of Darwin. It's a huge operation that must be carried out quickly and efficiently before the shell dies. The baskets retrieved from the long lines are loaded on board, cleaned and placed in seawater tanks for the journey to the Northern Territory. This highly efficient operation is a far cry from the old days when the sail-powered luggers first worked the coast and a lugger would send down one diver for a few ton of shell. The end result is of course the pearl, regarded by many as the most beautiful gem in the world. Malcolm, with his friends among the pearlers, has been invited to watch the grading and sorting of the harvest, a breathtaking spectacle few people ever see. On the table, several $1 million worth of gleaming pearls, and that's just a small percentage of the total number produced in a season. Nowhere else in the world can such magnificent gems be grown. The colour, size and lustre makes the highest grade immensely valuable. Of the thousands of pearls grown every year, only a few are top grade. Compared with the number of highest quality diamonds, large, perfect, cultured pearls are very rare. Pearls that grow abnormally, ending up as weird and wonderful shapes, are called keshish and are in demand for distinctive modern jewellery. And so from the humble oyster come the flawless gems for this exquisite necklace, valued at around 150,000 US dollars. No one can predict the future of the pearling industry. Cyclones periodically wreck the farms, boats are lost, and the shell beds can be instantly wiped out by huge seas. On some farms, the pearlers are fighting a disease that's killing much of the shell. But whatever the problem...